During World War II, there was a commander for whom a single step taken too slowly, or too boldly, could have sent the entire European battlefield down a completely different path. That commander was Bernard Law Montgomery, known as Monty. He was the general who broke Rommel at El Alamein, delivering the first decisive blow that halted what had seemed like the unstoppable advance of the German army. He was the man who set the tempo for the Normandy landings, where every mistake could have cost the Allies tens of thousands of lives. And he was also the commander willing to stake his entire career on Operation Market Garden, the Allies' boldest and most controversial gamble of 1944. To understand why Bernard Law Montgomery became one of the most influential generals of World War II, and why each of his decisions could shift the course of an entire front, let us return to the early years of the 1942. Before becoming a symbol of discipline and victory, Bernard Law Montgomery stepped onto a battlefield where Britain was truly on the brink of collapse. North Africa was not merely a land of deserts and tanks. It was the final defensive line preventing the British Empire from being driven out of the Middle East. If defeat came here, the Suez Canal would fall, vital oil supply routes would be severed, and Britain's military prestige would shatter completely. In that context, Montgomery was sent in not to experiment, but with a single mandate: to win. For standing opposite him was Erwin Rommel, the commander who had terrified Europe with the speed and ruthlessness of desert warfare. When Bernard Law Montgomery took command of the British 8th Army in North Africa in mid-1942, the situation of the British Empire had reached a state of alarm. After a series of defeats at the hands of Erwin Rommel, the 8th Army was not only short of equipment, but also suffering from a collapse in morale. Many expected Montgomery to launch an immediate counterattack to prevent Rommel from advancing any closer to the Suez Canal. But from his very first decision, Montgomery chose a path that would make him a controversial figure. He did not attack. Instead of rushing into battle, Montgomery halted all plans for an early offensive, focusing on retraining his soldiers, strengthening unit cohesion, and building up logistics. He stated bluntly to his subordinates that there would be no attack until the army was fully ready, and that the 8th Army would fight only one battle, but it would be a battle guaranteed to be won. This decision made many officers and political leaders in London uneasy, because in their eyes Rommel appeared weak and time seemed to be running against Britain. But Montgomery understood something many others were unwilling to admit. At that moment, the British Army did not have the strength to win a gamble. For weeks, Montgomery imposed iron discipline, reorganized the entire force, and ensured that every unit was properly supplied with tanks, ammunition, and fuel. He eliminated a mindset of passive defense and repeatedly emphasized to his soldiers that from El Alamein onward, the British Army would retreat no further. It was during this period that Montgomery made his famous declaration, "We will drive Rommel out of Africa." This was not merely a slogan to raise morale, but a statement of intent for a plan calculated down to the smallest detail. On the night of the 23rd of October 1942, Montgomery launched his attack at El Alamein. Under an unprecedentedly intense British artillery barrage, infantry and armored units advanced in unison, steadily grinding down the German-Italian defensive lines. Montgomery did not seek a rapid breakthrough through a reckless all-or-nothing thrust. Instead, he deliberately drew Rommel into a war of attrition, where Britain's logistical and industrial superiority could be brought fully to bear. When Rommel attempted to counterattack, he discovered that there was no longer any room left to maneuver or reverse the situation. The climax of the campaign came with the assault known as Operation Supercharge, in which Montgomery committed his main armored force to smash through the Axis's final defensive line. The result was decisive. More than 30,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner, and Rommel was forced to order a prolonged retreat westward. It was the first time in the war that British forces defeated Rommel in a decisive land battle. The victory at El Alamein immediately reversed the situation in North Africa, ending Britain's long streak of defeats and opening the way for subsequent Allied campaigns in the Mediterranean. More importantly, it forged Montgomery's reputation. A commander who did not fight fast, did not gamble, but once he struck, his enemy had no path of retreat. El Alamein also laid the foundation for the controversial command style that would define him for the rest of the war. cautious to the point of frustration for his allies, yet effective beyond denial. After his victory at El Alamein, Bernard Law Montgomery entered 1,943 inches, a completely different position. He was no longer merely the general who had saved the British Army in North Africa, but had become one of the most influential ground commanders within the Allied coalition. When plans for the invasion of Sicily were put on the table, Montgomery quickly revealed the trait that would define him for the rest of the war: an absolute refusal to compromise on how battles should be fought. The Allied High Command's original plan envisioned a broadly dispersed landing across multiple areas of Sicily, aiming to overwhelm the island through simultaneous pressure. Montgomery vehemently opposed this approach. Drawing on his experience at El Alamein, he argued that dispersing forces would only give the Germans opportunities to counterattack piecemeal. Instead, he proposed, and effectively forced the High Command to revise the plan, to concentrate the main landing in the eastern part of the island, around Gela and Syracuse, where the British Eighth Army could maintain tight cohesion, control the tempo of the campaign, and methodically crush the enemy's defensive lines. This decision immediately created tension within the Allied command. Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley of the United States made little effort to hide their irritation at being compelled to adjust their axis of advance to suit Montgomery's vision. In their eyes, Montgomery was both excessively self-confident and inclined to downplay the role of his allies. Criticism of Monty for arrogance and authoritarianism began to surface openly, not from the enemy, but from within the ranks of the Allied generals themselves. However, when Operation Husky officially began in the summer of 1943, Montgomery once again proved that his frustrating decisions were anything but impulsive. Under his command, the British Eighth Army advanced slowly but securely, steadily breaking through Italian defensive lines and forcing German forces into an orderly withdrawal. Rather than rushing forward in search of quick glory, Montgomery deliberately maintained a controlled tempo, preserved his strength, and denied the enemy any chance to create a second El Alamein, this time in reverse. While George S. Patton pushed aggressively westward and captured Palermo, Montgomery's forces continued to pin down German units in the east, compelling them to disperse their strength across multiple axes. By the end of the campaign, most of Sicily had fallen into Allied hands. More importantly, the island became a direct springboard for the invasion of mainland Italy, opening a new front that forced the Axis powers to stretch their defenses ever thinner. The Sicily campaign was not Montgomery's cleanest or most glamorous victory, but it demonstrated one essential truth: he was willing to be disliked, so long as he retained control of the war. Despite the friction with Patton and Bradley, Montgomery played a central role in organizing and sustaining Allied pressure in the Mediterranean. Sicily thus stood not only as a military success, but as a milestone marking Montgomery's transformation into a commander whose tempo both allies and enemies alike were compelled to adapt to. As plans to open a second front in Europe entered their decisive phase, Bernard Law Montgomery found himself in an unprecedented position in his career. Under the authority of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, Montgomery was assigned command of the 21st Army Group, bringing together all British and Canadian forces, the main northern thrust of the Normandy landings. In practice, during the early months of the campaign, Montgomery directly oversaw all Allied ground operations in Normandy, a responsibility that placed him at the very center of a life-and-death gamble in Western Europe. From the outset, Montgomery did not view Normandy as a mere amphibious landing, but as a battle of strategic tempo. On the 6th of June, 1944, as British and Canadian units came ashore on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, he immediately focused his objective on the city of Caen, the key transportation hub in the east. While many expected Caen to fall quickly, Montgomery accepted a different reality. Caen would serve as a magnet for German forces, rather than a swift, dramatic victory. When Operation Cobra was launched in late July 1944 and American forces punched through the German lines in the west, Montgomery immediately adjusted the battlefield situation. Shifting from the role of holding the tempo, he moved to close the encirclement. British, Canadian units advanced south from the north, while American forces drove up from the south, forming the trap known as the Falaise Pocket. Although it did not annihilate the entire German force, the encirclement resulted in tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers being killed or captured, completely shattering Germany's ability to organize a coherent defense in Western Europe. Normandy ended not with a single explosive moment, but with the systematic collapse of the German defensive line. By the end of August 1944, Paris had been liberated, Allied forces had crossed the Seine, and the Western Front was thrown wide open. Throughout this entire phase, Eisenhower remained supreme Allied commander, but it was Montgomery who kept the coalition war machine running at the correct tempo, despite political pressure and despite persisting criticism over the pace of operations. Normandy thus became one of the clearest expressions of Montgomery's command style. He accepted being labeled slow. So long as the front did not break, he was willing to endure unpopularity in exchange for an irreversible strategic victory. And it was here that he played a decisive role in pushing Nazi Germany into a position from which recovery on the Western Front was no longer possible. By late 1944, as Allied forces had pushed beyond France and were closing in on the German border, Bernard Law Montgomery believed that the moment to end the war had arrived. Before him lay a Germany retreating on a broad front, its Western defensive system not yet fully reorganized. If the Allies struck fast enough and deep enough, Montgomery argued, they could cross the Rhine, drive straight into Germany's industrial heartland, and bring the war to an end before the close of 1944. From this assessment, Montgomery proposed a bold plan to concentrate all available strength into a single, narrow thrust through the Netherlands, rather than continuing a broad, dispersed advance. He persuaded Dwight D. Eisenhower to prioritize logistics and firepower for this operation, built around the core idea of using airborne forces to seize key bridges deep behind German lines, clearing the way for infantry and armored units to race straight to the Rhine. This was Operation Market Garden, the greatest gamble of Montgomery's command career. The plan placed extremely high expectations. 3 British-American airborne divisions were dropped to seize and hold the bridges from Eindhoven and Nijmegen to Arnhem, the final gateway across the Rhine, while 30 Corps advanced along a single highway axis to link up the ADS. Entire corridor. Montgomery believed that within just 4 days, Allied forces would be standing on the far bank of the Rhine, but Market Garden quickly exposed its fatal limitations. The airborne drops stretched over several days, stripping away the element of surprise. German forces in the area were far stronger than initially assessed, and the entire operation depended on a single, narrow supply route that was highly vulnerable to disruption. When the airborne troops at Arnhem were isolated and failed to hold the crucial bridge, a chain reaction followed that brought the entire plan crashing down. When the operation ended, Market Garden had failed. The gateway across the Rhine remained firmly closed, and the Allies paid a heavy price, especially the British airborne forces. Montgomery's gamble to end the war early had not succeeded. Market Garden became a defining moment in Montgomery's career. It revealed the other side of his command style. When he chose speed over tight control of the battlefield's tempo, the risks rose sharply. After the failure of Market Garden, Montgomery was forced to confront his own limits. He understood that if he continued to pursue bold gambles on a front already stretched to the breaking point, the entire Allied northern flank could collapse after just one more mistake. In late 1944, Hitler's Ardennes counteroffensive suddenly tore open the Allied front, plunging American forces on the northern flank into severe disarray. Faced with the danger of a cascading collapse, Eisenhower was forced to make a crucial decision: to grant Bernard Law Montgomery full command of the northern sector. For Monty, this was no moment to seek a flashy counterstroke. He immediately halted, re-established the command structure, ordered American units to consolidate their positions, secure key lines of communication, and buy time. The cautious style that had been criticized after Market Garden now became the only remedy capable of preventing the front from disintegrating. As winter weather gradually cleared and Allied air power returned to the skies over the Ardennes, the battlefield framework Montgomery had patiently constructed began to take effect. German forces, overstretched and starved of fuel, slowly exhausted themselves against controlled counterattacks. By early 1945, the Ardennes campaign ended in German defeat, the last major offensive launched by Hitler on the Western Front. The Bulge did not bring Montgomery dramatic glory, but it proved something more important. In the most dangerous moment of the war, the man who could hold the tempo and avert catastrophe was the one who ultimately shaped the final outcome. After the Ardennes, Montgomery understood that Germany was on the brink of collapse, yet still capable of inflicting heavy losses if the Allies acted rashly. Before him lay the Rhine, the last natural defensive barrier for Germany in the West. This time, Monty sought no bold gamble. He deliberately returned to his familiar command style: overwhelming preparation, tight control of every phase of the advance, and denying the enemy any chance to mount an organized resistance. Market Garden had taught him that the war no longer allowed room for experiments, only for certainty. With Operation Plunder, Montgomery constructed a crushing river crossing. Overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and logistics concentrated along a single axis. At the same time, Operation Varsity, the largest one-day airborne operation of the war, was launched immediately behind the German defensive line to seal off the battle space. No airborne drops far from the objective, no extended timelines, no risk of isolating paratroopers as at Arnhem. Every mistake of Market Garden was coldly eliminated by Monty. The result was the rapid collapse of the Rhine defensive line. German forces were no longer capable of organizing large-scale resistance, and the entire northern front disintegrated. For Montgomery, Plunder, Varsity was not his most dramatic victory, but it was his most flawless blow. No risk, no theatrical surprise, yet absolute assurance that the war could not be prolonged any further. From the eastern bank of the Rhine, the road into the heart of Germany lay wide open, and the war in Western Europe entered its final, irreversible phase. Looking back at the entirety of World War II on the Western European and North African fronts, Bernard Law Montgomery was not the general who produced the most spectacular, explosive moments, nor was he remembered for reckless gambles that changed the course of events overnight. Yet it was Monty who repeatedly broke the enemy's momentum at decisive moments, and, more importantly, kept the war from slipping beyond Allied control. Every campaign Montgomery conducted reflected the same philosophy: victory only mattered if it did not shatter the entire front. Montgomery was controversial, often frustrating even to his own allies. He was stubborn, confident to the point of being labeled arrogant, and rarely concealed his belief that his way of fighting was the right one. But one truth remains undeniable. At the moments when the Allies could not afford to fail, Montgomery was often the man entrusted to keep the tempo, not to charge forward the fastest, but to ensure that every advance could hold its ground. History, therefore, does not remember Monty as a sudden genius or a gambler. He is remembered as a commander who turned patience, discipline, and cold control into strategic weapons. And in a war where a single mistake could cost hundreds of thousands of lives, it was precisely this style of command that helped bring the conflict to its